Avi Meyers, Northtown Neighborhood News Magazine, a presentation of Sonny Hirsch and myself. NTNN.org, all the shows are on YouTube, Community Policing, monthly meetings, 24th District throughout 2013, regardless of whatever budget concerns in most likelihood. Thanks to Commander Roussel and his various strategies, we thank you. It is time to introduce you to somebody who's been on the show once before in a completely different guise, who is now a published author. And when I was busy delivering Jewish Chicago, I happened to run into him over at Max and Benny's, and he showed me his book, and I figured this is very logical. Let's have him as a guest on the show. And I'd like to reintroduce you to the author, Richard Reeder. Richard, how you doing?
A pleasure, Avi.
First of all, my pleasure. And why did you decide to write a book?
Well, we all have stories to tell.
Yeah.
Okay, and now that I have a little time in semi-retirement, I just started basically drafting stories. I have a blog, a literary reader, okay, and I put the stories on the blog, and I wound up having 25 stories. And the interesting thing is that I teach a course at Oakton Community College, and one of my students, I was teaching a course on Sal Bellow short stories.
Cool.
And he was looking at the stories on my blog, and he said, "Richard, you should write a book." And he had written a book for a small press called Amica Press.
Yeah.
And I said, "Okay, I'm going to do it." And basically, the press had an editor and edited my stories. And this September I published the book called Chicago Sketches, 24 vignettes about people and places in my life in Chicago.
And by the way, this is where we show the cover.
Yeah.
Chicago Sketches, 25 people with various well, you say it.
People and places.
Yeah.
People and places that had an impact on my life. And the stories, I think, are emotional. And I think a lot of your audience, Avi, will be able to connect with these stories.
Well, as a matter of fact, you know what? Why don't you, we've got time, why don't you read us one?
Perfect. Okay.
And it's not super long, so stick around, guys.
No, and you'll love it. To me, it's a poignant story, and it sets the tone of the book. The story is entitled Rabbi Mendel. Rabbi Mendel, a man in his mid-40s with unforgettable cerulean blue eyes, opened the small black trunk and took out 3 stick puppets. The evil Haman was wearing a tiny felt 3-cornered hat affixed to his head. Brave Mordecai looked august in a diminutive robe made from corduroy. Beautiful Queen Esther looked stunning with orange hair made from knitting yarn, topped by a cardboard diadem. Our Hebrew class Purim party was about to begin. Rabbi Mendel skillfully manipulated the stick puppets as he related to us the Purim story in his heavily Yiddish-inflected English. We all cheered and rattled our groggers in glee when Mordecai knocked down Haman and dragged him across Rabbi Mendel's desk to the toy gallows to be hanged. Good was once again triumphing over evil in a story told by Jews for more than 2,000 years. Rabbi Mendel had stared evil straight in the eye just a few years before in Poland. The Nazis spared him from immediate execution because he was a master tailor, and they needed him to make uniforms for the German army. He survived Auschwitz because of his needling skills, but his wife, 2 daughters, and parents were all put to death in the gas chambers there. Underneath his cot in the concentration camp barracks, he had hid the Purim stick puppets that he had made for his daughters in better times. After Auschwitz was liberated, Rabbi Mendel lived in a displaced persons camp in Germany, where he taught tailoring in an art school. He came to Chicago in 1949, sponsored by his second cousin. He got a job as a tailor in a men's clothing store on Roosevelt Road. And to make a little extra money, he was hired by Congregation B'nai Reuven to teach Hebrew to young Jewish boys twice a week after their public school courses. B'nai Reuven was an Orthodox Lubavitcher shul, and although no one in our family was observant, this synagogue at 13th and Kedvale was the only one left to serve the dwindling Lawndale Jewish community. My parents wanted me to have a sound foundation in Judaism and the Hebrew language, so I was enrolled in the Hebrew school at B'nai Reuven. I had Rabbi Mendel as a teacher, and although he was not officially a rabbi, he was a former yeshiva student, and he was steeped in knowledge of Torah and Talmud, and everyone called him Rabbi Mendel out of respect. I enjoyed Rabbi Mendel's class and learned much from him. But 2 months after the Purim party, In May 1955, my family moved to West Rogers Park. I often thought fondly of Rabbi Mendel and his puppets, especially at Purim time. Many years later, though, in 1978, I was attending a book signing of Isaac Bashevis Singer's Sosha at the old Barbara's bookstore on North Clark Street, when I glanced at a man of perhaps 70 who looked somewhat familiar. As I approached him, I knew by those cerulean blue eyes that it was Rabbi Mendel, and he remembered me. And after the book signing, we went out for a cup of coffee. He told me his life story, inspired by the storytelling of his literary hero, Singer, with whom he had been conversing animately in Yiddish earlier that evening. It seems that Rabbi Mendel had a nice career as a tailor with one of the major downtown department stores. He remarried. He had a son and a daughter, both of whom his children delighted each Purim in watching their father perform his stick puppet show.
It's beautiful. Very beautiful.
Thank you.
It's a great story.
Thank you.
So, and you got 24 more.
I
You don't get to read them.
Well, I wanted to share this with your audience, Avi, because
That was great.
Yeah, because really, I go back to my childhood.
Yeah.
Okay, and this was a memory of mine from 9 years old. I have one from the first time I went with my father to Wrigley Field. It's when I was 7 years old, and what it meant. You know, seeing Pat Piper and attention, tension, please. You remember that? Just a memory. But you know, it was a story about a baseball game at Wrigley Field, but it was a story about going to a baseball game with my father.
Yeah.
And what it meant to me. And we lived on the west side. We took the Roosevelt Road trolley, took the train up to Wrigley Field.
Wow.
Those kinds of stories. But also it's stories about my career. I don't know if you know this. I used to work for the city of Chicago.
No, that I didn't know. I know you worked for Ort.
I worked for Ort for many years, 10 great years with Ort, but I worked for the Mayor's Office of Employment and Training, and I write a couple of stories about my experience with city government. I write about different jobs I had in social service agencies. Yeah. There's a poignant story about my best friend Howie Katz, who lived at 2722 West Estes in this neighborhood. My best friend, and we used to go, his father used to take me to hockey. They had hockey tickets for the Blackhawks. We went to 20 hockey games together.
Cool.
Howie died at the age of 20 of cystic fibrosis. And it's a story about my best friend. I call it Forever in Our Hearts, because when I go to West Lawn Cemetery now to visit my parents' graves, Howie's in the next section. And they're on the tombstone, Forever in Our Hearts.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. Well, we could talk another 20 minutes, but I've got to leave room for the other two guests. So at this point, I want to thank you very much, Richard Reeder.
A pleasure,
Appreciate
sir.
you being here.
A pleasure.
And if people would like to be in touch with you?
Absolutely. Give me a call. Call me at 847-542-4624.
Thank you very much, and good luck.
Thank you.